Well, good morning. If you're joining us live, thank you for doing so. Thank you for making the time. If you're watching us at a later time, thanks too for doing that. So, right off the top, before I introduce myself, I thought I heard Kelsey reference a Pop Tart. Did I hear that correctly? I think so. So, good call. Well, my name's Bob Larson. I'm familiar with most of you from the Pleasant Hill campus. I'm the campus pastor in Colfax, so I know those folks. Most of the people in Ankeny have not yet had a chance to meet, and so just want to let you know who I am, why I'm up here. I also serve with a ministry called the Adult and Teen Challenge of the Midlands. Been with them for about 26 years, and so what I want to share this morning is something that goes along with the series we've been talking about here. Spring cleaning is the title of our series, and a spring cleaning, of course, is a time when you kind of look around the house and you spruce things up, and maybe you go downstairs and you say, that's where that thing went, and you recapture it and you use it, or you say, why do we have all this stuff? We need to get rid of this. We're personally in the process. We're going to be moving next month, and so we're finding all kinds of things that we've been dragging from house to house to house. And now that our kids are grown and gone, it's time to get rid of it. And so spring cleaning is the time when we do those kinds of activities. And in our personal lives, it's good to take a season like we're doing right now of spring cleaning. And so today I'm going to talk about, the title of this would be Look at Me. Look at Me would be the title of our spring cleaning today. And so there's a few basics sometimes we need reminded about. You see a lot of people out at the workplace, maybe your neighbors, maybe family, maybe friends, and so forth. You see a lot of people exerting a lot of energy, a lot of expense, and a lot of time, and just a lot of energy overall to be recognized. In other words, they're saying, maybe subtly, but they're saying, look at me. And what we're looking for a lot of times in those cases is validation, affirmation. Am I okay? I need to hear from you. Am I okay? I need to see your reaction. And so when that happens, though, a lot of times people end up still feeling empty. And so despite all the energy, despite all the effort to be validated, to be affirmed, to get a signal back that I'm okay, sometimes we still feel very empty. And why is that? Well, I think big picture, the reason we feel empty a lot of times, despite our best efforts, if I put it in dietary terms, is that we're consuming empty calories. And you consume empty calories, you get what empty calories have to give you. Nothing. Well, we need to be recognized and we need to be affirmed. We need to be validated. Those are God-given needs, and so that's not something we make up. God hardwires us with those needs, but what God gives us a need for, He also creates the ability or a healthy, loving way to meet those needs. And so that's what we want to look at this morning, because He not only created the need, but the provision. And as the song says, the old song title is Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, right? And when we go looking for love or for validation on the wrong places, we're going to come up empty time after time after time. Well, false remedies produce false solutions, which, aren't really solutions at all. And so what a lot of people do in those cases is they grind away, white knuckle it. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. I still feel empty. Maybe I need to ramp up my efforts. And so I do any number of things, and we may touch on a couple of those things this morning. But I often, when I teach, I like to give the sentence in one, or the message, I should say, in one sentence, or maybe a key phrase. And so just something you can, bite-sized, you can take away with you. And so here's today's message in one thought. If I could boil it all down, it comes down to this: impact versus attention. Are you looking to make an impact, or are you looking to get attention? And it really comes down to motivation. The motivation many times for impact is helping others and making a difference. Helping others and making a difference obviously makes an impact. The motivation many times for seeking attention is validation, it's affirmation. And so hey, if along the way some people get helped, that's awesome. But the bottom line is I need to be affirmed. I need to have that stamp of approval on my heart, on my mind. And that's pride. And so we talk about pride. I'm going to talk today about three people. And the first person is this person. When we think about pride, I can think of one person above all others who exemplifies pride. When you think of the word pride, this one person comes to mind. It's not a professional athlete. It's not an entertainer. And it's not a Kardashian, okay? The one person I'm thinking of, soap represents pride and looking at self, that a mental diagnosis was named after them. So that's pretty serious. This person is a character from Greek mythology by the name of Narcissus. And so if you're not familiar with Narcissus, here's his story in a nutshell. Narcissus was an attractive young man who valued things of beauty, things of form very much. He was so taken with himself, but he also had this side of him that he was filled with disdain toward any who were attracted to him. And so here's this young woman by the name of Echo, and Echo was attracted to him, and she would follow Narcissus wherever he went and make advances toward him, and he rejected her time after time after time. He rejected her sometimes in pretty harsh ways, but the point is, Narcissus rejected Echo. Well, one day, there's another character in this story, character by the name of Nemesis, who's in Greek mythology, the god of revenge. The god of revenge, Nemesis, saw these harsh rejections, and he decided to take matters into his own hands, so he lured Nemesis to a pond, which wasn't hard to do. He lured Nemesis to a pond one day, and in that pond, Nemesis saw his reflection. And if you look at this picture right now of Narcissus, just look at that for just a minute, and here's what we see. See how taken he is with his own image? It's not enough to stoop over and look into the pond and see your reflection. Narcissus has gotten down and he's laying on the ground so that he can get a real close-up view. He didn't want anything to impede his view of himself. And so you see in this picture that he's really taken with himself. You see that he's positioned close, again, so nothing comes between him and his reflection. And the final observation I have about this picture is you notice the position of Narcissus' hands. He's reaching out as if it's not enough to gaze at my beauty. He needs to touch his beauty. He needs to touch his face and his form. And so that's the story of Narcissus. And the point of this whole thing, of course, is that pride has consequences. The consequence of pride is an obsession with self. An obsession with self always leads to death. And that's, you say, okay, well, that's a Greek myth, and, that's just a story, and that's a good point, but prove it. Well, I will prove it because God says the same thing, that pride and obsession with self lead to death. Here's what he says. It's exactly what he says. Proverbs 16 says, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Jesus confirms that. Later on in the book of Luke, Jesus says, all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So again, you could say, well, okay, that applies to Narcissus, or maybe that applies to some, like I said earlier, maybe some athletes, entertainers, or people of that nature, people who really flaunt themselves, who are really out there with who they are and what they're all about and trying to get attention. But that doesn't apply to me. Well, maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. So it's worth taking a look at while we're doing some spring cleaning. So here's a good way to think of this. A modern version of the pond in which Narcissus saw his reflection. A modern version of that, of course, would be digital, and it would be social media. Think about your activity on social media. Think about the level of activity. So first of all, how many social media accounts do you have? You may have one or two. You may be like me and have zero. Which doesn't mean you're immune to this if you don't have social media accounts. But think about social media. How many posts do you make on social media that some way, some form or fashion point back to you? You're the focal point. You might be posting about something or somebody else, but really it comes back to you. How many pictures do you have of yourself? Here we are at this location. Here we are on this vacation. Here we are at this place and that place. How many pictures are there of you on your social media accounts? Are you able to take a Sabbath? I think Ben spoke about Sabbath a couple weeks ago. Are you able to take a Sabbath, some time away from social media without going crazy? And if you were able to take that Sabbath, if you were inclined to do that, if you didn't post anything, would anybody miss your posts? Would there be a void in somebody's life, in a relationship you have with someone? Would there be a void because the posts that you make are so substantial, so weighty, so influential? Or do they amount to empty calories? And so that's one way to think about pride, about looking into the pond. Those answers begin to get to the bottom line. What's my motivation in life? What's my motivation for the things that I do? What's my motivation for the things that I don't do, that I'm not part of? Well, social media isn't the only way to strive to earn affirmation. There are other ways. Think about the gym, going to the gym, my activity there. Think about work. Think about social settings. Even think about church and Bible study and small group and how I interact with people, or whether or not I interact with people. Get a little more personal. How about body art and coloring and piercings and things of that nature? What's my motivation for those things? And so let me pause right here and say there's a couple things we need to know about narcissistic behavior. And I feel like when I say that term narcissistic, that sounds so harsh. Don't mean it that way. But I think you get the idea. Pride, looking at self, having a self-motivation. There's a couple things that we need to know about that type of behavior. There's two general flavors for that on different ends of the spectrum. So therapists quantify these in this way. The first kind of person would be a grandiose narcissist, or somebody who's very flamboyant in their presentation. When they walk into a room, you know they walked into the room, and you know an hour later whether or not they're still in the room. They're very aggressive. They're very outspoken, very dominant. They pursue attention. They pursue power. And so again, that's the kind of person who you know they're there. On the other end of the spectrum, you have therapists call these kinds of personalities vulnerable narcissists. And this is much more shame-based behavior. This is the kind of person who, if you're at a gathering and they walk in a room, you'll never know it. In fact, you could go probably the whole evening and never even realize that they're in the room. You just wouldn't have that context, because that's not what they're about. They're more introverts, they're quiet, they're reserved, as I said, oftentimes more shame-based. And so because of that, they're easily slighted. They feel very easily rejected. Something very innocent, a comment or a non-comment could set them off, but you'll never know that they're set off. And so there's a grandiose, there's vulnerable, and there's all kinds of flavors in between there of people who look at themselves. But either way, it's an obsession with self. Whether I'm flamboyant and you know I'm here, or I'm over here and I'm very subtle, and you never even realize I'm there, and you never realize that something you said offended me, because I will never tell you that, I'll just absorb it. Either way, it's an obsession with self. It's focus on me. And God addresses that. Here's how God addresses that. He tells us not to think too highly of ourselves. First of all, Romans 12, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. Okay, so that's pretty clear cut. Don't think too highly of yourself. On the other end of the spectrum, don't think too lowly of yourself either. We're familiar in 1 Samuel, we're familiar with a character by the name of Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel, and he was anointed king. God put his hand on him to make him king, and Saul wasn't really up for it. In fact, when it was time to recognize him as king, they had to go looking for, where's Saul? They had to go find him. He was hiding in a bunch of baggage, a bunch of luggage, and they had to bring him out. And here's what Samuel says to him. Samuel says to Saul, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. So there's a balance. But where's the balance? Because God just tells us don't think too highly, don't think too lowly, but there's a balance there. Here's the balance. Proverbs chapter 3, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. And you might say to yourself, rightfully so, well, how does that represent balance? That doesn't seem to speak to this issue at all. And I think it does, and here's why. Because we become wise in our own eyes. This is important. We become wise in our own eyes when we regard what we think about us as more important than what God thinks about us. So whether I think I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread, or whether I think I'm a piece of junk down here, either way, I'm putting my opinion of me over God's opinion of me. And that's how I become wise in my own eyes, by regarding my truth as ultimate truth rather than God's. Well, wherever you and I are on this issue, however you see it, a good question to ask is, what drives this? What's behind all of this? Whether it's I'm out there and I'm big and bold and everybody knows I'm around, or I'm down here and I'm just kind of quiet and reserved. What's behind all that? Why do we seek attention? I mean, is it genetics? Is it environment? Is it parenting? Is it culture? Our culture, by and large, has always been more communal, and now it's shifted in the last bunch of years to more of a self-esteem culture. What's behind this behavior? All these things. Well, you know what? The truth is, you and I could chase that around forever, and there are people who paid a lot of money to chase this around. We could chase these, try to find these answers, chase it around forever and ever, and come up with all kinds of theories, all kinds of ideas, all kinds of solutions or therapies to apply to this. And some of those therapies, some of those solutions, some of those insights will truly be insightful and probably helpful to some degree. Some of them might even be biblical, because ungodly people even know the Bible just inherently. A business person knows that a gentle answer turns away wrath. They know that if I treat a customer right, even though the customer's acting up, if I treat them right, they'll be satisfied, they'll probably come back. They may not know that's a biblical concept, they may not know that's in the book of Proverbs, but inherently they know treat people right, and they may be a customer for life. And so you can come up with therapies and ideas about narcissistic or prideful behavior, but you can also come up with a lot of theories and a lot of therapies and a lot of solutions that are totally counterproductive, that actually do more harm than good. Here's what God says, 1 Corinthians 3. God says, the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. The wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight. And there again, we can't put what we think, what we discover, what we've come up with above what God says, because God's wisdom is the ultimate wisdom. Well, this issue of being motivated by seeking love and seeking affirmation, again, a normal need God hardwired into us, but this whole issue of pride and all that, it can be so obsessive, so oppressive, so domineering in our lives, so relentless, that people need real answers. I mean, I mentioned I work with Adult and Teen Challenge. For years, I mean, we see it all the time, and you probably do too, wherever, maybe when you interact with people, is that sometimes folks come and they understand, they realize this is an issue. I seek attention like a sponge seeks water, and I hate that about myself. I wish I weren't like that. I don't know why, and they genuinely want to be free of that. Well, here's the deal, and what I'm about to say is very important. So if you are finishing your Pop-Tart, or you're multitasking, you got your phone in your hand, I'm going to ask you just to take a time out for that activity for just the next couple seconds, because I want you to catch what I'm about to say. Those answers, where does this behavior come from? What's the root of it? Why am I like this or like that? Those things may provide insight and understanding, truly provide some insight and some understanding. And they might, therefore, provide some temporary relief. But there's a difference. Here's the key. There's a difference between insight and understanding and healing. Jesus provides healing. And so I'll use as an example somebody who's physically abusive, because I see them fairly often. And some of them know exactly why they're physically abusive. I have been physically abusive in my life because X, because I was physically abused, or that's what was modeled to me, or that demonstrated to me that I get my own way when I am abusive toward people. So they understand it totally, but that doesn't mean they're healed of it, and they want to be free of it. And so understanding the root of these things is necessary, but only Jesus can provide the healing. Well, let's get to the bottom line. What drives the need for attention, whether it's grandiose or vulnerable, whether it's aggressive and obvious, or whether it's passive and a little more subtle? To uncover that, as I said a minute ago, it's necessary to look at some of those things. My family of origin, look at patterns in my life, look at biological components, things that have happened in my past. We need to do so, though, through a certain lens. So it's important to look at those things, but it's important to do it through a certain lens, because I don't want to look back at my family of origin and blame anybody and beat them up and cause, just vomit on them. I want to do so through a certain lens. There's one bottom line, and everything comes down to this. Now, here's the second person. I told you I was going to mention 3 people this morning. Here's the second person I want to mention. We talked about one person earlier who represents pride and self. Here's the second person. And there's one person, this one person wants you and I to focus on ourselves all the time, whether it's very overt and obnoxious, or whether it's very covert, and you don't even know I'm thinking about myself all the time. There's one person who wants you and I to think about self all the time, and Jesus tells us something about this person. John 10, verse 10. You probably know it. Say it with me. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. There he is. There's the bottom line. There's a thief who comes to kill and steal and destroy. But Jesus came that we would have life and have abundant life. And the word thief is interesting. The Greek of that is this word klepetes. Klepetes sounds like an English word because it's a derivative of an English word called kleptomaniac. Kleptomaniac is a person who has a compulsion to steal. When I was in high school, I had a girlfriend one time, and we met up for a date or whatever, and she said, hey, from a very good family, and we met up, and she said, hey, do you like my shoes? I'm like, yeah, I'm 17, sure, whatever. And she said, oh, yeah, I stole them from Yonkers or wherever. I'm like, what? Why would you do that? Just because I could. I'm like, okay. I don't know if that was a pattern in her life or not, but that's kleptes. Kleptomania is stealing. And here's the definition of kleptes: a thief who steals by stealth in secret rather than in the open with violence. A thief who steals by stealth, secret, rather than in the open with violence. It's one thing to maybe come home, you've been out and you come home and you find that the door is broken open and your TV and your computer and whatever, some other valuables are missing. That's not a good thing. Or you're out and about and you left your wallet and your car keys and your phone on a table or somewhere, and you come back to find them and they've been taken. They've been stolen. That's not good. Neither one of those situations are good. It's kind of another deal. It kind of becomes personal now when something is done in secret. When maybe it's somebody you trusted, somebody you thought you knew, and they steal from you. You're having a great time, and you find out later they were a pickpocket, and before you knew it, they were right in your pocket, and they took this or they took that from you. Then it starts to become personal. And I believe that the enemy, Satan, the devil, does this in secret, not only because he wants to steal from us, because he wants to steal something from you, but he also wants to steal something clear down here, identity and validation. And when you steal something in secret, then it starts to become personal, and you start to wonder, man, what's wrong with me? Why did I do this? Why did I leave my stuff there? Why did I trust this person? And then it becomes personal. So here's the point. A subtle way of stealing you and I from our relationship with God, a subtle way of doing that is to have us focus on ourselves. Focus on my goals, focus on my accomplishments, focus on all my relationships. Or, on the other side of things, focus on all my problems, focus on all the limitations, focus on the fact that, so-and-so can do this, has that gift or ability, and I don't do that. I don't sing. I can't do that. Or focus on all the problems in my life. Either way, the enemy has us independent from God. And it's very subtle. We don't even see it coming all the time. So what's God say? How does this healing happen, this healing that's so necessary? Well, here's the answer that the Lord gave me about probably 3 or 4 weeks ago before I even started working on this message. I was reading a psalm, and this just jumped off the page at me, and it applied perfectly here. So it's timely. What God has to say about pride in our lives, about our motivation, turns out it's the exact same thing he says about the time in which we live with coronavirus. We're not able to get out and interact with one another, and some of us aren't able to work. Some of us have had income reduced or lost completely. Some of us are sick. Some of us are not. Just whatever it might be, here's what God says about it. There's a lot of occasions in Israel's history where things were crazy. Maybe not a physical pandemic or a medical pandemic, but somewhat of a spiritual pandemic, because as you read through the Bible, especially the Old Testament, you see Israel going through times where they're way up here and they're connected to God and they're obedient and He blesses them, and the nations around them, leave them alone. And then they disobey and they fall clear down here. They disobey and they suffer consequences, and then they're raided by neighboring nations and neighboring kingdoms. And then a new king comes into power, and he serves the Lord, and he tears down all the high places. And Israel's back up here. They're obeying again, and they go up and down and up and down and up and down. And into that, God speaks. Psalm 46 applies perfectly to that and to what we're talking about today. Here, Psalm 46 starts with this, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. I like the way that sounds. I like the way it sounds. I like better the fact that it's a reality. But I like the way that the psalmist starts that psalm. And then he goes on. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but he goes on and he references these things in the following verses that you'll see on your screen. He references the earth giving way, mountains falling into the sea. Here's mountains quaking, the earth melting, desolations on the earth. Verse 9, he mentions fire. Well, pretty clearly, though the psalmist starts out with the fact that God is our refuge and strength, as you continue to read pretty clearly, something significant is happening here. And you know how in your Bible, it'll say, for instance, Psalm 46, and then under it, it'll have a little tiny lettering that says something really obscure to give you context. It'll probably say, often it'll say something like, a song for the harp to be sung to the tune of We of the Willie, or something obscure that gives me no context whatsoever for that psalm. Psalm 46 is one of the psalms with the little text in there that's worth reading, because here's what it says. It says, for the director of music of the sons of Korah, a song of the sons of Korah. And I looked at that and I said, well, what does that mean? I went back to number 16, looked up Korah. Some of you are familiar with Korah. Korah is from the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, and he incited some men, 250 of them total, to rebel against Moses and his leadership. And so they kind of had this standoff, Moses and these men. 250 total of them challenged Moses' authority. And if you read in number 16 what happened, there's a summary of it in this psalm, Psalm 46. Psalm 46 references earthquakes, and this is exactly what happened to them. In number 16, the earth opened up and swallowed many of these folks. And those who were able to scramble away were struck down with fire, lightning. And that's what Psalm 46 is referencing. And so now you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, gosh, I'm not getting the good news here about how I get healing from all this. Hang with it, because we're just about to get there. Here's the point. Even in the middle of all hell breaking loose for the Israelites, even in the middle of a pandemic when life is interrupted in significant ways, even in the middle of my life where I tend to be focused on me. I want what I want, and I want you to give it to me, and I need love, and I need validation, and I'm looking for it from you. Even in the middle of all that, God speaks into it, and here's what He speaks. He speaks an invitation. Verse 10, be still and know that I'm God. I'll be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth. And the thing that strikes me about this is the psalmist writes from a particular perspective, from his vantage point. Hey, just kind of factually, here are the things that have happened to Israel. Here are the things that happened to Korah and his 249 friends. And in the middle of that, the tense changes. Verse 10 changes to first person. God speaks directly into it. Be still and know that I'm God. And I believe that's what God is doing and wants to do in your lives, in our lives right now, is speak directly to us. Be still and know that I'm God. I've given you opportunities, though the circumstances maybe aren't what you would choose. Many of us have extra time on our hands, or our schedules are just a little different. We have time to be still and know that He's God. We have time just to spend with Him. But here's the deal. Stillness is a state. Stillness describes relationship with Him. Stillness isn't a physical posture necessarily, because we can't just sit all day long and be in prayer. So when the psalmist, when God says, be still, He's saying, be focused on our relationship. Be centered upon me and not upon all the circumstances, though the circumstances are real and they need to be dealt with in a lot of different ways. And so you and I can still be at rest while we interact with other people, while we figure out what's next, while we go about our business. We can still be still. That was a weird sentence. Now, let me tell you one final person, and I'll close with this. So this is the third person I want to mention, because there's one person in Scripture I can think of who really, really lived this whole idea, this whole truth of not being centered on self, but being centered on God. Here's one person who lived that perfectly, and we see him in the book of John, in the Gospel of John. Go to John chapter 3. We've got John the Baptist coming on the scene, and he's baptizing these new believers, right? And now all of a sudden Jesus shows up, and people are going to Jesus to be baptized. And John's disciples are kind of scratching their heads saying, hey, John, people are going over to Jesus instead of coming to you now. Parenthetically, they might say, doesn't that bother you a little bit? Here's what John says about that. Verse 29, he says, that joy is mine. I get complete joy out of the fact that they're coming to Jesus. That's why I came. I'm the forerunner. I'm not the star of the show. Jesus is. I'm the one who points the way to Him. And John says in verse 29, that gives him joy. And what's the basis for that joy? Verse 30, He, Jesus, must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less. That is a person who received their affirmation, their love, their validation, their stamp of approval, mentally, spiritually, if you will, from their relationship with Jesus and not from what people were doing around them. And so unlike Narcissus, who focused on himself, you and I can choose to be still and to focus upon Jesus during this time. Not just this time with the pandemic, but when this thing's over and done in years to come, our validation can continue to come from our relationship with God. And by doing so, we make an impact. We don't just gain attention for ourselves, we make an impact that helps other people. Let me pray. Lord, this morning we thank you for your word. Thank you for the example of John, who received great joy by the fact that he pointed people to Jesus and they went to him. And so this morning as we worship in these last couple songs, Lord, as Kelsey mentioned earlier, maybe eliminating distraction, I pray that we would just have an opportunity here to center totally on you and worship you in Jesus' name. Amen.